Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. On today's program, we have the distinct pleasure of talking to Dr. Michael Wagner about Alberta separatism and the recent memorandum of understanding between Ottawa and Alberta, and whether or not this changes the calculation. So stay tuned. Hey, and welcome back to Liberty Dispatch, friends, where we bring you Canadian conservative news and analysis from an unapologetically Christian perspective. We really thank you for tuning in. If you want to get all of our interviews, including the full extended interviews, which you can only get behind the paywall, you go over to ldcanada.substack.com. That's ldcanada.substack.com and check us out over there. You will not regret it. We have a lot of wonderful discussions about very, very important topics going on in our nation. Also theological topics that are really important to politics and theology and the work of the church that is ongoing before us. But today, we want to specifically focus in on the current situation that is happening in Alberta. There's a lot of discontent with the continued reign of the Liberal regime now for over a decade in Canada that has largely targeted Alberta and has largely been unfriendly to our friends in Alberta. And there is a greater degree of growing skepticism to the idea that Canada can be reformed, and the talk of Alberta separatism, whether it's as a 51st state or as an independent state or whatever that might be, has grown significantly. And it's in light of that a recent memorandum of understanding between Mark Carney and Premier Danielle Smith was agreed to. There was a big press conference. It all happened before the UCP's AGM, and it was in many ways a political theater. But does it actually change the equation as it pertains to the current political situation in Alberta? And for that, to answer that question and others like it, we are joined today on the program by Dr. Michael Wagner. Michael is an independent researcher and a writer with a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta. He and his lovely wife live in Edmonton, Alberta, where they have been home educating their 11 children, and they've done a yeoman's work in that field. And I was just at a recent conference where people rightfully gave Dr. Wagner great applause for his dedication to his children's education. So without further ado, let's get in the conversation with Dr. Michael Wagner. Dr. Wagner, thanks so much for joining us on Liberty Dispatch. It's wonderful to talk with you. And Dr. Wagner, it was wonderful to connect up just a couple weeks ago, finally in person. We've gone back and forth online for a couple years, so it was just wonderful to get to know you and break bread and enjoy each other's company. So thanks for coming on the program. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And thanks for having me on. And it was also very exciting for me to meet you and some of the other people at the conference as well.
Yeah. And we found out, too, that we had a connection to where I live there. You had a little bit of connection to Manitoba and where I hail from. And it's very, very awesome how the Lord works. And it's such a wonderful time when you get to meet brothers and sisters in the Lord, and especially who are thinking along the same lines and who are trying to press forward the crown rights of King Jesus in every area of life. And you've done some amazing work to that end, brother, and I'm so appreciative of it. I'm actually going through, at the conference, I picked up the Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, and I am going to go through that. I'm just finishing up a book, but that's next on the reading list. And Should it go well, which I imagine it will, I will be buying copies for my elected officials in the area. So, anyways, the reason I wanted to have you on, because I'm interested in what's going on in Alberta, because it sure seems like there's a lot going on in Alberta. And I know you are a good guy to talk to about Alberta politics, especially from the perspective that we're doing news and analysis here with the Dispatch. So, Dr. Wagner, headlines, the recent, news events of the day right before the UCP AGM 2025. You have this amazing press conference, all the pomp and circumstances. Mark Carney has signed an MOU with Premier Danielle Smith. And the gist of it is this is creating a new relationship between Ottawa and Alberta that is going to be mutually beneficial, both to Canada as a nation and specifically for Alberta as a province within the United Canada. That's the framing. That's the what's being sold to the people. I'm interested, is that how Albertans are seeing it, or is this a lot of political theater, as it were? And maybe before we kind of talk about that, what are the good, the bad, the ugly as far as the MOU? We don't have to get into all the minutia of it, but from your perspective, was this MOU what it was made out to be by Carney and Danielle Smith's team?
Well, I don't think it's what it was made out to be. I mean, there are good things to it in the sense that the federal government agreed that there might be a path forward for an Alberta pipeline. Like Alberta has been denied several pipelines since Justin Trudeau Prime Minister in 2015, and so much that Albertans were hoping for in terms of economic development was shut down by the Liberal government. And if Justin Trudeau was still in power, that's just the direction we'd be going in. So the MOU does represent a bit of a positive development in the sense that the Liberal government has conceded that there might be a situation in which an Alberta pipeline to the West Coast could actually be developed or created. Now, Justin Trudeau would never have agreed to that. So this is a bit of a change, a bit of a movement in a good direction from Mark Carney in the sense of saying, well, maybe there could be circumstances for Alberta to get a pipeline. So that's kind of the good side of it. Now, in order to get that, Alberta had to agree to certain, climate change type policies, like a higher carbon tax on industrial emitters and things like that are not as good for Alberta. But of course, I guess there has to be good, give and take in any agreement. But fundamentally, nothing has really changed. I mean, like I say, it's a lot of it has to do with political optics. It looks good, and Danielle Smith needed some kind of a victory before the United Conservative Party AGM, which happened just a few days ago. She needed to be able to go into that AGM and being able to say that Canada can work, that she can make Canada work, because Canada has not worked for Alberta for a very long time. And that's kind of, an underlying basis for support for Alberta independence, is that Canada does not work. And so she wanted to be able to go to the AGM and tell her people, we can make Canada work. And this is an example of making Canada work, that Mark Carney is willing to, make deals with Alberta so that Alberta can move forward economically. So there is a sense in which it does look positive. But I'm very skeptical, and many of the people at that UCP AGM were also skeptical, because an important independence leader here in a bear pit session, went up to the mic and condemned the MOU, and then asked how many people in the hall were for Alberta independence, and a vast majority of people cheered and stood to show their support for Alberta independence. So, among the UCP people anyway, there's a lot of skepticism about the MOU.
Well, and that's really interesting, because that's contrasted with the rain of booze that rained down on Premier Smith when she talked about the MOU. So it's very clear that within even her base, there's a lot of skepticism with the MOU. And is there good within it? I guess I don't want you to enter Premier Smith's head, but I'm just trying to think politically. is her calculation, okay, we get an MOU from Ottawa. Sure, it's non-binding, but it kind of sets the stage for, maybe creating this context where it's easier to move forward. It now maybe creates a context where business say, well, the feds have signed on, at least in part, to changing the economic landscape as it pertains to Alberta oil. And she's trying to get these really quick wins where we can easily say, well, the emissions caps off, some of the worst net zero policies, they're gone. And she's just hoping that if we can change the conversation around Alberta oil production, and the context, and get rid of some of these worst, most obstructive regulations right now, that hopefully there will be election in the future and Carney will be gone and we'll have a new prime minister, where then we can actually enact something better. Is that kind of, from your perspective, if you're trying to maybe steelman Danielle Smith's side, is that kind of the thinking that's going into the process for Danielle Smith?
I think so. I think you basically nailed it. Like, she needs to be able to convince people in her party that not to support Alberta independence. Like, that's kind of a bit of a threat to her leadership, in the sense that there are dedicated independent supporters within her party who want her to take a much stronger stance, and she doesn't want to. She's been saying all along that her belief is that Alberta can work within Canada and that Canada can work, and so she needs that kind of a public presentation like you discussed. She needs to be able to tell people that things are moving forward for Canada, and especially with business leaders who have been concerned for so many years. It does look like a positive to them, and of course business leaders are an important part of the UCP base as well. So it is, she needs something publicly that she can hold up to people and say, yes, we're moving in a good direction. Even if Carney's Liberals are still in power, and like you say, it's a minority government, so theoretically his government could fall within, a matter of months or a year or so, and potentially the Conservative Party would get elected, and that would change things dramatically for Alberta. Mm-hmm. Although, I don't see the Conservative Party as a solution, because there's reasons for that, but definitely the Conservative Party is much better for Alberta than the Liberal Party. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
So you really nailed it with what you said there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I'm just trying to, because I know there's still a lot of skepticism around separatism. So I'm trying to, as best as I can, represent maybe the UCP mainstream conservative position within Alberta politics to the best of our abilities, to then, show why, in your calculation, this is maybe Pollyannish and a little bit ridiculous. Maybe that's not fair, but so let's maybe camp out here for a little bit. Why is it Danielle Smith's position that she believes that Alberta is better in Canada? Why? Like, when you're having these discussions, you've been a part of these conversations for a long, long time, for decades, before the conversation was as public as it is now. What is the argument to, hey, Mike, I get what you're saying, but really, we have to stay in Canada. Canada's great, and Alberta needs to be a part of this united Canadian nation. What is the best argument to that end, from their perspective, would you say?
Well, I would say that the vast majority of Albertans do want to stay within Canada. Like, the best solution that most Albertans would support would be a reformed Canada, where Alberta can develop its economy and its oil industry without being hindered by the federal government. So most Albertans, even, a lot of people in the independence movement, would prefer Alberta to stay in Canada with a system where we're able to do the things we need to do in Alberta. Like, most independent supporters are reluctant supporters. And that's why it would be so easy for the federal government to win them over to the Canadian side. And that's what Danielle Smith was trying to do. If you can get the federal government to move a little bit, then she can say, look, we don't need to leave Canada. We can get movement at the federal level. And that's actually what most Albertans would support. So, like, I do think that she's appealing to a broad base of people. And like, I've even spoken at a independence meeting once where they started by singing "O Canada." Like, that's how committed so many Albertans are. Like, Albertans tend to be very patriotic Canadians, as Danielle Smith, I think she pointed that out at the AGM. And that would be the preferred outcome, is a reformed Canada where Alberta can, express itself and get its economy developed here. That's the vast majority of people would prefer that. It's just that for so many years, and especially under Justin Trudeau, they keep slamming the door every time we want to move forward with our oil industry development. And of course, the oil industry is the key to our prosperity in Alberta. So whenever they close the door to an oil project, it means we have less prosperity, less jobs, that kind of thing. And that's what people want. People want to work and earn a living and so on. And when the federal government prevents that from happening, it frustrates people. And after that happens so many times, people just get the impression, we're not going to get anywhere within this country, so we need to start our own independent country as Alberta. But they would prefer, most of those people would still prefer to stay in Canada if that was possible. And so it is actually smart on Danielle Smith's part to get something like the MOU to say, like, we are moving in a direction that, that makes it look like perhaps the federal government will work with us and we won't be constantly frustrated like we have been under Justin Trudeau. So that's kind of like, she's actually pointed out that Justin Trudeau essentially created the modern expression of the separatist movement in Alberta. Like, it had died out under Harper for the most part, and it started up again. So Justin Trudeau is the cause of it, and the federal government is the cause of it. The Liberal Party of Canada is the cause of it, and those causes, if they would just step back a little bit, they could take the pressure off and reduce support for separatism in Alberta for most people. And so, like, the ball is very much in Mark Carney's court, and so he's wise to move a little bit in this direction, even though he really hasn't given up anything, because there is no pipeline project right now. But it makes it look like, well, maybe they could be at some time in the future. And so that will reduce the support for independence among some people, because most Albertans would prefer to stay within Canada.
Yeah. So your understanding is, she's maybe doing a little bit of bean counting as far as, like, she understands that the appetite for separatism, though growing, is still rather small, and that she's, at least at this point, not willing to stick her neck on the line for what she thinks is a rather fringe movement. So she's trying to work within kind of the general will of the populace, but also trying not to alienate the separatist movement. And this is where the MOU kind of comes in. But my problem, though, Mike, is I don't think Albertans are fooled. I think Albertans see this as political theater. I think Albertans recognize that there's some disastrous aspects to the MOU that they would never want, and they realize that this is all hypothetical. So to tout this as a huge win for Alberta is rather silly. It's not really what Danielle Smith's making it out to be. But then also there's the added aspect of this gives some political cover to Mark Carney in helping him seem like more of a reasonable centrist politician rather than the green wingnut that he actually is. That's comes out in his book. His book Values, where he equivocates on the word value to just come up with a bunch of nonsense. But anyways, there's an aspect there that is her political career on the line if separatism goes forward? Or to me, is there a place for Danielle Smith within a separatist movement? Because I'm just trying to understand why she's willing to cozy up to Ottawa on a very thin, vague MOU with, with a leader who's clearly not pro-Alberta, with a party that's been anti-Alberta. Why is she more willing to cozy up with Carney than to hold Carney's feet on the fire and say, listen, buddy, there's a serious separatist movement going on in Alberta, and if you don't come and play ball, there's no reason whatsoever that we shouldn't be, as Albertans, supporting this movement for the best interest of the constituents within my province. Help me understand that dynamic, because to me, it seems like Wow, she's making a big political calculation and trying to cozy up more with Ottawa than, the other way around.
Yeah, well, I think like she does want to win re-election. I think like she wants to have the UCP as the majority party for Alberta, and if
Mhm.
she was to move herself in a more separatist direction, I think she would actually reduce support for the party. Like the separatist support right now in the polling is like maybe 35% or something like that. So she has to keep in
Which is
mind that if
actually
she
very
was to,
high.
it is
Yeah,
like especially historically. Yeah,
yeah. So it's not it's not a small fringe movement at
yeah,
all.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Sorry,
Actually,
continue.
there's no, that's okay. I'm going to come back to that then because you're,
Yeah.
but because like if she wants to win, like the next provincial election is only less than 2 years away, and if she wants to win, she needs to have support not just of people who want Alberta to get a better deal, but also just basic federalists. Because Alberta, and I think this is similar probably with most provinces. There's a huge difference between rural and urban. Like if there was a independence referendum just in the rural areas, for sure it would pass very easily.
Hmm.
But Edmonton voters are dead set against independence right now for the most part, and Calgary's kind of leaning against, but that's where independent supporters could get support. But she needs to have she needs a broad base of support to win re-election. And so if she was to go hard on the separatist thing, she's taking that would be a very big risk politically. Now, with that said, though, one of the missing ingredients for the Alberta separatist movement all along has been a leader, like a prominent, respected leader. And even back to the early '80s, when the movement was first getting off the ground, that was pointed out at that time as the one missing ingredient. If a very respected leader would say, "We've got to do this," that would dramatically increase support automatically. So even if it's 35% right now, let's say if a major respected business leader came forward and said, "I'm going to lead this, we need to get out," I'm sure that the support would increase. Now it's impossible to predict how much would increase, but it would definitely increase and get a lot more credibility. So
Yeah,
the
because
movement has always
people tend to follow leaders. That's how that works.
that's yes,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
exactly the thing. You need a leader to represent ideas. Like even if there's an idea that has a broad base of support, if you don't have someone publicly articulating that and making it respectable in the public eye, people will tend to not publicly support it as much as they would if there is someone speaking on behalf of that cause. So that movement has always you know lacked the leader that it needed. Anyway, so I think basically I'm just trying to answer your question by saying I think she's looking toward the 2027 election and she wants to have a broad base of support. And if she took a more stronger independent stand, that would actually limit her ability to win that election in 2027. And I think, like from what I've seen, I think she's a sincere federalist. I think she sincerely wants Canada to stay together, and I think she sincerely wants Alberta to stay within it. And so
Hmm.
this is, she says, is very consistent. But if we did have a leader, who was representing the independence cause, that would change the ball game altogether.
Yeah.
In the current circumstance. Now, I did want to get back just briefly, if you
Yes.
don't mind,
No,
to the
absolutely.
idea. Yeah, you talked about the 35% being high, and it really is. One of the things I've pointed out in one of my books is that, before Pierre Trudeau, there was no separatist movement in Alberta. So Pierre Trudeau is the father of the Alberta separatist movement because he created it with his policies in the 1970s. But even in the 1970s, support for separation, when polls were done, would only be like a single digit support, like 5 or 6 or 7%. But what changed everything was the National Energy Program in 1980. Pierre Trudeau was reelected in February of 1980, and then in October, at the end of October of 1980, he brought in the National Energy Program, which was designed to hammer Alberta's oil industry. And it did. It devastated Alberta economically. Like many thousands of people lost their jobs, businesses were closed, and I've even met people just this year who said they knew people who committed suicide because of the devastation of the National Energy Program. Like that's how devastating it was to Alberta, and that changed the polling on independence. So when polling on support for separation in Alberta has been done since 1980, it's always been in the double digit figures. Like early on, it'd be like 15 or 17%, but it's grown until like say in the 1990s would be like 20% or 25%, and now it's 30 or 35%. So that is high. Like people say, well, that's not a majority, and of course it's not a majority. But when you look at the trends over time, support for independence in Alberta has been growing over several decades, and it's the highest it's ever been, probably with the polling that's done recently. So if a strong leader, a respected leader, was to come forward, that would make a huge difference. But I just wanted to support your contention that 35% is actually a very strong basis of support for the movement.
Yeah, I mean what we've talked to, I think political science dudes like yourself have talked about, like even a 10% intransigent minority within a populace can actually create massive wide scale cultural and societal trends. So we're talking, 3x that percentage within Alberta, and it's growing and growing and growing and growing. So it's not this fringe regional movement that Ottawa's trying to kind of make it out to be, which is really weird because we literally have the Bloc Quebec Qua, which is like a separatist fringe regional movement, but I guess it's okay if they do that in Quebec. But as it pertains to the West, you're not allowed to have political and provincial interests because I guess the West is supposed to always have second-class citizenship to our Eastern allies. Which is a part of the provincialism and a lot of the angst that has been there between the East and the West in Canada, basically for the entire existence of our nation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about. You are very hard on the need for Alberta to separate and be its own independent nation. So, Dr. Wagner, pretend I'm Danielle Smith and I am a arch federalist. I believe Alberta should be within a united Canada. Why convince me that my thought is nothing more than essentially delusional naivety, maybe a little bit of nostalgia, right? And why it is best for Alberta to actually read the story that they're in and react accordingly and stop pretending that the situation isn't what the situation most clearly is.
Yeah, well, like most Albertans and even most Federalists in Alberta realize that Alberta's been getting a raw deal for several decades. The question is how do we deal with that? And most Albertans would say, and Danielle Smith would say, well, let's fix Canada. And so my argument is, and in my books, I write about how we've been trying to fix Canada for decades, and it never gets anywhere because the federal government is not interested in any of the solutions we've proposed. Now, the two main areas where we've tried to fix Canada is one would be the Senate reform movement, which actually started by the early 1980s, and of course the Reform Party of Canada. Those are the two main historical factors I like to talk about because they show how hard Alberta has tried to fix Canada, and Canada rejected the fixes. Like if you go back to Senate reform, that actually began under Peter Lougheed was our premier, and he put together a committee to recommend changes to Canada's constitution to make things better for Alberta. And one of the members of that committee was a law professor who proposed Senate reform. So we'd have elected senators in Canada, and there'd be an equal number of senators from each province. So that kind of set in motion the Senate reform movement. And basically by the mid-1980s, the most popular form of Senate reform in the West was what's called a Triple E Senate. That'd be a Senate where the senators are elected, there'd be an equal number of senators from each province, and they have effective powers. Those are the three E's: elected, equal, and effective. So a Triple E Senate along those lines would provide Western provinces with representation in the national government. And so there was there was the Committee for a Triple E Senate, a Canadian Committee for a Triple E Senate. This idea was also endorsed by the Reform Party, and it was actually endorsed by Alberta Premier Don Getty and his government. And they actually even put together a small committee to promote the Triple E idea across Canada. So this was a very popular idea in the West. And to make a long story short, Stephen Harper, he became prime minister in 2006. He had been a Triple E proponent. And of course, as prime minister, he could not change the Senate himself. But he tried to bring in incremental reforms in the Senate by with legislation that would implement for Canada what Alberta had been doing. Like Alberta, several times in the last few years, has had elections to elect people whose names could be put forward to the prime minister to appoint for the Senate. Like right now, the prime minister appoints senators, and he just appoints who he wants to. But what Alberta did was have elections, and the people who won those elections, their names would be submitted to the prime minister, and he could, appoint the people who were elected. That way, we'd have elected senators rather than just simply appointed senators. And Alberta did that first in 1989. Like that's Canada's very first Senate election. And actually, Reform Party candidate Stan Waters was elected, and actually Brian Mulroney did appoint him to the Senate. And we've had a few other, like I mentioned, Senate elections since. And under Harper, he appointed some of those people to the Senate. But so Harper was trying to do these incremental reforms by having provinces elect people who could be appointed. And he also wanted to put term limits on the Senate. But to make a long story short, there ended up being a court case where the Supreme Court ruled that the kinds of changes that Stephen Harper wanted to make incrementally to the Senate could not be done without a constitutional amendment. So the Supreme Court of Canada in 2014 in that decision killed Senate reform in Canada because in order to reform the Senate, we'd need, a constitutional amendment, and getting a constitutional amendment in Canada is so hard. It's kind of almost impossible. So that being the case, Senate reform was killed. Now, the other example I wanted to give was the Reform Party of Canada, which actually started because of Brian Mulroney. Trudeau had been killing Alberta, and so when he resigned in 1984, and eventually in an election, Brian Mulroney became prime minister later in 1984. Albertans thought our problems were over because all of our members of parliament were progressive conservative MPs, and that was Brian Mulroney's government. Our MPs were in the government. We're going to get a better deal now. The Conservative Party is a solution to our problems. But 2 years later, this was an issue that actually related to Manitoba. That there was Canada had purchased the CF-18 fighter jets, and there was a very expensive government contract to maintain.
We were supposed
to
get that in Winnipeg.
That's the thing. See, the government held a competition. There was 2 cities that could do it, Winnipeg and Montreal. The government held a competition, and according to the government's criteria, Winnipeg won the competition. And so Mulroney gave the contract to Montreal. And so that actually, more than anything else, spurred the creation of the Reform Party, because Westerners realized, even when we get our own guys, we elected these guys to govern for our benefit, and they stabbed us in the back because they wanted to get the votes, in Central Canada. And that's a very key aspect of Canadian political life, is that Ontario and Quebec have the majority of the population, and so they have the majority of the members of parliament, and so Ontario and Quebec are key to forming the government. You have to win Ontario and Quebec to win government and to keep government in Canada. And so federal governments will always cater to those 2 provinces, instead of the West, because they need those provinces to stay in power. So even though Mulroney was our guy, or we thought he was, he still has to cater to the central Canadian provinces if he wants to maintain power, and he does. And so he's going to stab the West in the back when he has to maintain power. So that's what we found out in the 1980s by a hard experience. And so that led to the creation of the Reform Party. So, the Reform Party won large numbers of MPs from Western Canada in 1993 and 1997, and yet they couldn't get the changes done that we needed, to make things better for the West within Canada. So if we create our own federal political party and get all these MPs sent to Ottawa, and they can't do it, and if we try, and we even get a prime minister sympathetic to our Senate reform ideas, and he can't do it, if we can't get these things done through the proper channels, it can't be done. That's my argument. Preston Manning with the Reform Party could not make the changes. Stephen Harper, even as Prime Minister, could not make the changes we needed. So if these guys can't do it, who can do it? It just cannot be done. And I'm not talking about something that happened for 2 or 3 years. I'm talking about something, these were processes that took several decades. We worked on this, like thousands of Albertans and other Westerners put in their time and their money year after year for decades, and we couldn't get reforms. So why do we believe we can get a reform now, especially when we still have a Liberal Party government that's focused on climate change like Mark Carney is? So my argument is we did try to fix Canada. Like I say, most Albertans would say, let's fix Canada. And I say, yeah, great idea. But we've been doing that and it doesn't work. Because actually that idea was first proposed in print, actually.
Dr. Wager, we're actually further. I think everybody in Alberta would probably admit to the fact that we're actually further away now today to the reforms that you're talking about than we ever were during the height of all these controversies. It's not as though we've maintained status quo for the last 30 odd years. We're actually getting further and further away from the type of Alberta within a united Canada idea that so many people have pursued, because Ottawa's growing in its aggressive hatred for the West. It's growing in its statist apparatus. More and more power has been centralized in Ottawa at the detriment of all the provinces, not just Alberta, but every single province. This is the reality of the situation that we're dealing with, that people have to, not only has Alberta tried, but it's gotten worse, and it's gotten more hostile, frankly, and it's not surprising that because of this, the separatist sentiment is growing and growing and growing. So, would you agree then? As much as we don't want to be nasty to people that would support, the federalist position that Daniel Smith has, it's rather Pollyannish. It's rather naive to think that Alberta can be what Albertans want Alberta to be within the current Canadian structure.
Yeah, I think it's Pollyannish and naive, but we have to remember though, like the knowledge of history has been so lost in the last few generations. And so
Mm-hmm.
my books on independence are history books, literally saying
Yeah.
this is what has happened and this is what you need to understand. And even, there's people here who've heard me talk or read my books and they're my age or older. And they said, I was alive at those times and I forgot that. I forgot that those things happened. And, that's kind of a natural human tendency, is to forget the past because we're focused on the present. But it's also
Yes.
part of our culture that we degrade history. Like history, that's kind of something that somebody does as a hobby or something. It's not important. But it's so important to understand history if we're going to understand where we are politically and what needs to be done. And so
Yeah.
so many Albertans have not paid attention to what's been going on, or they forgot what's been going on, and many of them also remember the Canada of the past. This is one of the things I've had to deal with, is that
Mm.
people love Canada, but the idea of Canada that they love is not the Canada we live in anymore. Like, I don't mind saying, I'm happy to say, the first 100 years of Canadian history, like, this was a great country. Like, of course we had problems, there's nothing perfect about Canada, never been a perfect country ever in history, but
No.
Canada was as good as it gets for the first 100 years. And I very much point to Pierre Trudeau as the turning point in Canadian history. Like, not only did he create the Alberta separatist movement by his attacks on Alberta, he also undermined Canada in so many other ways. And one of them, the biggest one, being the change of the Constitution in 1982. Like, Trudeau
Okay.
totally
I'm
undermined Canada.
I'm glad
Sorry.
you're going there. Sorry, because that's exactly where I wanted to steer the conversation, because that's actually the talk, which I will link in the description below, that you gave at the Cantero Institute conference um, about. And I think this further underscores what we've been talking about. Why this political theater with the MOU, when, though it's trying to quell separatism, it's not realistic, and it doesn't take into consideration the actual on the ground circumstances of Canadian culture and politics. And it really is operating on a Pollyannish view of Canadian history and Canadian law. So help disabuse our leaders, our readers, our listeners of this notion, because I think we're just waking up to this. I think you've been talking about this forever. I'm sure you feel like you've been the prophet screaming in the wilderness and nobody's been listening to you. But they are now, because I think there's been a huge revelation, especially over the last 5 years, with how our government's acted, how the charter is not even worth the paper it's written on, because it can't actually, in practicality, protect the constitutional rights of Canadians, because there's so much deference given to administrative law in Canada that constitutional rights don't really seem to matter in all practicality. So help disabuse our listeners of why the charter is good, but then also like wrap that into, okay, because of what Pierre Elliott Trudeau did, because of the legal revolution that took place in Canada with the charter, it actually created a country that essentially cannot be reformed in the way that Albertans want Canada to be reformed, and therefore further bolstering your idea that Alberta separatism is the only path forward for Albertans.
Yeah, there's two lines of argumentation I want to use here, and the second one will be the one, like you mentioned, I gave at that presentation in Ontario. But the first argumentation I want to refer to, and this kind of segues from the independence movement, is Trudeau was making these changes to the Constitution after he was reelected in 1980. So it was 1981 was the year when a lot of the negotiation was going on for the change in the Constitution. Now, during that time also, that was in the wake of the National Energy Program. So that's when the Alberta Separatist movement was very strong for the first time. One of the key people in the Alberta Separatist movement was a female lawyer named Dr. Ruth Gorman. Now, Dr. Ruth Gorman was probably the most prominent female lawyer in Alberta at that time. She had been famous kind of as a civil liberties type of lawyer. Anyway, she saw Trudeau's charter for what it was. It was very, very harmful to Canada and especially to Alberta. And her line of argumentation against the charter was they deliberately excluded property rights. Like in the English-speaking tradition, we think of the protection of the three important rights: the right to life, liberty, and property. Those are the three important rights. So when you remove one, so actually each of those protections restricts the power of government. If you have the right to life, liberty, and property, the government can't kill you or take your stuff or imprison you or whatever without just cause. So those are the protections. They restrict the government. So when you remove one of those, you're reducing the restrictions on the government. You're actually empowering the government. So by removing property rights and only protecting life and liberty, you're actually expanding the power of the state. And so that was her argumentation. Sure, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just on this note, because I'm sure you know the history better than I do. So I want to. My understanding is the original draft of the Constitution of the Charter did include property rights. Do you know why that did not make it into the final copy? Because, I'm just thinking, a strong Liberal supporter of Pierre Elliott Trudeau will be saying, Dr. Wagner, let me just remind you that Mr. Pierre Elliott Trudeau did actually have property rights in the draft. So you're saying this is some sort of thing that he's doing, but, we know that it was in there. Maybe help us understand because that seems to me to be an unbelievably dangerous retraction in any charter, because that, for us as Christians, that is a basic God-ordained, God-given right that individuals possess, that governments, if they are going to be legitimate governments, must recognize. Like they don't have the ability to tell us whether or not we have these rights. These rights are pre-constitutional. They're God-ordained. They're given to citizens. And if a government's going to be legitimate, they must actually recognize these rights. So that's a huge omission. So how did that not make it into the charter? And why wasn't this happened, before I was born. Why wasn't everybody's head exploding and hair on fire because of this? Like, help explain the historical context, and then go back to what you were talking about, if that's possible.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. The earlier draft of the charter did include property rights, and Trudeau traded that away to get support from the NDP. Like the NDP was adamantly opposed to having property rights in the Constitution, and they told Trudeau, we will support it if you remove property rights, and he didn't have any qualms about that. So he removed that. Now, so it was a political trade-off. But on the other hand, Trudeau would not have traded off other rights. We know that he had a socialistic background, so he wasn't deeply committed to property rights. So it's easy for him to trade that off. But if someone had said, let's trade off language rights, he would have said no. You know what I mean? There were rights that he was adamantly committed to, and then there was rights he was willing to trade off. And property rights was one he was willing to trade off. So that was not important to him. So it was removed,
which is just so absurd. Language rights are somehow more important than the most basic rights of the individual that are pre-constitutional. Like, you're dealing with an asinine, absurd, well-educated Laurentian elite when that's the calculation that he's making. Totally absurd, but. So that helps. That does help us understand why that's not in there, though. Now, okay, sorry. See, I didn't even need to draft questions, because I'm like, the second we get talking, Dr. Wagner, it's all going to come out. Why? What was I going to ask? Oh shoot, I've lost the thread now.
Actually, I think you were going to ask why there wasn't more of an uproar about that.
Well, yes. Why wasn't there more of an uproar about taking, jettisoning that from the draft? Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Well, like one of the things that's important to remember is that the provincial governments were at first the main opponents of the charter idea. They
Yes.
didn't, they knew, because actually the charter was actually a federalizing, a nationalizing, a centralizing document, because it takes powers away from the province. So the provinces weren't enthusiastic about it, but they didn't complain about the loss of property rights, because each of the provincial governments, they saw property rights as like an obstacle to some of the things they might want to do. Because they're the governments,
Yeah.
and if
Yeah.
you put
Perfect.
if you put property rights in the Constitution, not only does it inhibit the federal government, it'll also inhibit the provincial governments. So when it was removed, the provincial governments, for the most part, didn't complain, because that actually strengthened them in relation,
They're
to
like,
the Constitution. So
oh, eminent domain, awesome, let's go. you know, yeah, yeah. Oh man, that's
so
so
they're like,
insidious. That's crazy.
so that yeah, there was opposition. Like I mentioned, Dr. Ruth Gorman traveled around Alberta to oppose it, and she wrote articles and things. And of course, there was other people supporting her. There was the party that she had helped found, which was the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta, which was a separatist party. People like that adamantly opposed the charter, in part because of the lack of property rights. And there was probably other conservative groups in Canada that did as well. But at the political level, there wasn't the kind of opposition that we would have hoped for, on that issue.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I was going to ask you another question that I forgot. But so, because this, I mean, we're talking about property rights now, and it's so relevant given the Cowichan decision and some of I mean, we're living in the story as it's unfolding right now. And, people don't literally know if fee simple property rights are even going to be respected, not only in British Columbia, but potentially across all of Canada right now. This is an unfolding story, and we don't have the charter right where we can say, look, it says it right here, you can't do that. We don't have that. So what would you say, though? Because I have heard within the Cowichan conversation, some people say, we actually do have property rights, though, right? Because we're within this context of British common law history. So it's always been an unwritten right and an assumption in Canadian legal tradition. Therefore, yeah, sure, it's not in the charter, but it's obviously something we adhere to. Is that a good argument?
To a certain degree. It's not that we lack property rights altogether. It's just what happened by removing it from the charter, you diminish it in relation to other rights, right? Because there's kind of a hierarchy of rights when you go into court or things like that.
Yes.
The charter rights are the top priority rights, and then rights that aren't in the charter are kind of lower priority. So it's not that we don't have property rights at all. It's just that they still have some recognition in common law and things like that. But they're much diminished in comparison to the rights that are in the charter. So the rights are there, and so that argumentation, might have a degree of plausibility. And actually, it really depends on how that plays out in court. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen. But we don't have the same degree of property rights as we would have if it was written in the charter. If we had it in the charter, it would be hard and fast. But all we have is what's kind of left over from the pre-charter era that would protect us. But so not having property rights in the charter makes a big difference. It's a big deal that it's not there, but we still have something, and hopefully that something will be enough to protect us in the future, but we don't know at this point.
Dr. Wagner, was that not even part of the logic behind the charter is that unless it's written in the charter, right? This is, I'm thinking of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's logic. If it's not written in the charter, well, then it's not really, Canadians don't really have it, right? We need the written constitution to make clear these rights that Canadians have, and if they're not clearly delineated within a written constitution, therefore their existence is rather tenuous. So even just thinking through that logic, yeah, sure, we can make it appeal to the common law tradition in the British Anglosphere, but it's how often has our courts actually practically recognized the legitimacy of appeals to those certain things, especially when they're not expressly put down in the charter, especially considering that the things that are expressly put down in the charter are often ignored by those same justices. So, I mean, it's very convoluted, but it's at the same time, to me, that's a very Pollyannish approach to things in Canada as well. what explains all this weird nostalgia and inability for Canadians to actually read the story we're in, Dr. Wagner? And maybe that's a hard question to answer. But to me, it's like Canadians have such a high sense of our country and what it has been and what the ideals of Canada are, that we're totally unwilling to actually look in the mirror. And it's like we have this amazing amount of self-confidence. We're the best country in the world. We're the most handsome man that the world has ever seen. But we're never going to look in the mirror to actually look whether or not that is the actual case. Like, that to me is the picture in my mind that I'm struggling with.
Yeah, well, like historically, Canada was great in so many ways. Like we referred to this earlier. I mean, when you look at our contributions in World War I and World War II, like very disproportionate to our population. Like we contributed way above, we punched way above our weight. So historically, we've had these great things, and these are the kind of things that people grab a hold of and hold on to. You know, we celebrate Vimy Ridge, you know, every year with November 11th and so on. And so this is kind of, and maybe like at least when I went to school, these were the kinds of things we were taught. And so, you know, it's easy to have that positive view of Canada if you don't look at the last 50 years or so of its history. And like, you know, most people don't read the history anymore or don't remember it. It's so easy to forget. And like I say, history is diminished in the current culture.
Yeah, it's literally like, I'm just thinking through this. Like the analogy is, it's literally like we were the most handsome quarterback of the high school team, but we've refused to look in the mirror for the last 50 years. And it turns out now we're like a 250-pound dad who hasn't shaved, and we're still wearing the disheveled clothes that we wore in high school, and everybody's looking around and they're like, wow, that's one ugly dude. But because of our past reputation, we're just like, no, we're great, we've got everything licked. That's
Actually, can I make
absolutely.
Can I just make a point here? Like one of the things too is there are many people who have benefited from Canada's decline. And you know that there's, you know what I mean. And so they're even more happy about Canada now than they were before. And when you look at our, you look at our media, like the kind of, left-wing media, they're happy about these changes. Like, the CT celebrates the kind of things I talk about to explain Canada's decline. They don't see that as decline. They see that as progress, right? They're the progressives.
Yeah.
All the things we see, like abortion, same-sex marriage, laws restrict religious freedom, we see that as, look how bad Canada's becoming. They say, look how good Canada's becoming. And that's what they write about in the media. And so, that's the message that most Canadians would get in the media, that things are actually getting better. Like every time the abortion goes up, that's an improvement, right? Yeah. Every time there's more gay marriages, that's an improvement. We're getting better and better. And we're even able to slap down these bigots like Sean Foyt so that he can't get a public, platform because, he's got the wrong message. And they see that as progress. In contrast to how we see things.
Yeah, no, okay. So, and this is maybe, okay, so I'm going to ask you one last question, have a comment on it, and then if you have the time, I want to go behind the paywall for our subscribers and, talk a little bit about, maybe some of your prescription for how Alberta can move forward. What are some of the things they can do? We can talk a little bit along that lines, but, the question that I wanted to pose to you is a lot of your push for Alberta separatism just a basic understanding of what Christ taught when he said a nation divided against itself cannot stand? And you're maybe one of few people in the room who are willing to say, this is describing Canada. Canada is totally untenable. Alberta's position within Canada is totally untenable because the kind of Alberta that you want, dear Alberta citizen, is not the type of Canada that the Laurentian elites want. The people in the East that hold all the power. So you're literally trying to create a system that the Lord of Glory, the omnipotent God, said cannot possibly work.
Like there are elements of what you said that I would tag on to. Like for the most part, most people who believe in Alberta separatism do so for economic reasons.
Yes,
and like that's kind of like the core basis of it. But and so that's kind of the things we talk about for the most part. But I
Yeah.
do agree, like Canada is like going down culturally as well. And
Hmm.
so by breaking away from that, that gives us the potential to make a better society here that's not as left wing, as the rest of the country is. Because when we look at voting, trends in Canada, Alberta always votes conservative, at least historically.
Hmm.
So federally, Alberta has not been electing the left wing governments. Federally, Alberta has been voting toward the right, and our left wing governments are voted in, by Toronto, Montreal, those kind of places, right? So Alberta does have some more of a conservative aspect to it, and so if we were able to cut ourselves off from the country, we kind of free ourselves from some of those negative cultural aspects, and we have the potential, at least, to be a better country that way. But I do want to emphasize, though, that there's Christians in the separatist movement, and there's non-Christians, and among the
Yeah.
Christians, we realize if Alberta does not turn toward Christ, it actually isn't going to be improved. You know what I mean? Like if we become our own country
Yes. Yeah.
and we keep in the same progressive, so-called progressive downgrade, we're going to be just as bad off as if we remained in Canada. So there's kind of there's a two-track thing here. On the one hand, I do believe we need to pursue independence for Alberta to be able to pursue prosperity and freedom as a province. But I know too that Alberta, like the people of Alberta, are a bit more conservative than the rest of Canada, but we're not like more virtuous or something like that.
Yeah.
We're still sinful and so on. And if Alberta does not turn toward God as an independent country, it'll go down just like the rest of the country, and we won't have achieved anything. So it's
Yeah.
very, very important, that we recognize that the fundamental thing, not just for Alberta but for all of Canada, is we need to turn back to God. Like that's across the board, right, for every country
Yeah.
and every Canadian. But in spite of that, though, like in our current situation, having Alberta move towards independence would solve some of our problems, would solve some of our economic problems. And also, too, when it comes to the charter and property rights, we'd get to write our own constitution. And so this kind of ties in with what you were saying, like, how can we change Canada's constitution if it's bad? How can we make it better? Right now, there's no appetite in Canada for making a better constitution that I can see. But if Alberta
Yeah.
became independent, we'd have to write a new constitution. And so we'd have the opportunity to do it right. We could look at what was done wrong in the past, and we could do a better one, and we can have property rights and things like that. So I think Alberta should move towards independence, and that would give us the potential for making a better country, but it doesn't guarantee a better country. So
Yes.
I hope that kind of tied in with what you were trying to get with your question there.
Oh, exactly. And yeah, I think like Albertans have to realize the prosperous Alberta that you want in the way that you want it is not what most of Eastern Canada wants. And they will oppose you at every single turn, and not only oppose you, but steal your money to support themselves while they do it. And I have no doubt, like, I'm not an Albertan. I've never lived in Alberta. I love our nation for its diversity in the regions and all these things. And I think there's good things about each region, maybe not Quebec, but no, I'm just joking. It's actually beautiful. But, we just like Albertans just have to come to that realization and stop living in nostalgia land and actually read the story that they're in. And that's what we've talked a lot about on our show. Guys, we can't be looking back with rose-colored glasses on what Canada was supposed to be when Canada has actually made an ideological break with so many of the things that we loved about Canada as a nation. And that's where we are as Canada, is we're a nation divided against itself. And the progressives, though, they have the advantage because they know where they want to go, I think. But at least they know what they're pursuing. But because of, I think, the nature of conservative thought, we've been slow to recognize that the rug has been pulled out from under, and we're proceeding on this rosy idea of what Canada was supposed to be in its origins. Well, not understanding where Canada is now and the legal revolution and constitutional revolution and all this stuff that's taken place from under us has happened. So this is why these kind of conversations and the history and the research and all the stuff that you've been doing are so important for Canadians, because listen, the first step to recovery is not being delusional and in denial anymore. Right? It's coming to terms with where you are at and then making positive changes moving forward. So, I don't want to black pill people on the circumstances in Canada, because I think if we can get rid of the Pollyannish kind of thoughts, the nostalgia, and move forward in a coordinated manner, as a conservative movement, there's positive cultural changes that can happen. I don't deny that, and maybe that's Western separatism and other things of that nature. But we have to stop being silly about these conversations and idealistic about these conversations and deal with what's actually happening. And Dr. Wagner, that's why I'm so thankful for your work. So if people wanted to know more about you, if they wanted to get that history that's been forgotten, if they wanted to dig into Canada's Canadian heritage, and like you talked about, some of the principles that made the first 100 years of our nation so great, without even a written constitution, where can they go to get more of your stuff and continue their further education on the issues that we've been talking about?
Yeah, well, the best place to go would be merchantship.ca. Merchantship is a homeschool business. They sell homeschool supplies, but they also sell my books. So if you go to merchantship.ca and search my name, my books would become available there, for order online. And I do have a website. It's it doesn't have a lot of development. It's just drmichaelwagner.com. I have some of my articles and also, again, links to books on merchantship. But probably the best is just to look in the books that I have written that are available on merchantship.ca. If they wanted to pursue any of these topics, that would probably be the best place to go.
Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Wagner, for coming on the program. For all our subscribers, you can get a couple questions that I'm going to ask Dr. Wagner about, hey, how do we create, if he were in charge of creating the new Alberta, what are some things that we could do, right? Because this is a real problem, Dr. Wagner, that you're pointing to. Is Alberta, if they move towards separatism, are they just going to be a little Canada? Are they going to imbibe all the worst aspects of our kind of modern Canadian culture still, but just maybe have a little bit more economic freedom? Is that the path forward, or is there actually a deeper, more profound change that needs to be made within not only Alberta, but Canada and all across the Anglosphere? So that's what we're going to be talking about behind the paywall, but you can't get that if you're not subscribed. So go over to LD Canada. That's LD Canada.substack.com. You can get all our content unfiltered in its entirety over there, ldcanada.substack.com. Check that out. Please subscribe. Share this conversation out with more people, because these are the type of conversations that I think are relevant to all Canadians, whether you're in Alberta or not. These are the type of realistic conversations that we need to be having as we're Christians who are trying to read the story that we're in Canada and move forward with wisdom in these coming days. So, Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for all the work and research and all that you've done to really help the history of Canada survive, so then we can actually move forward with a realistic assessment of our nation. And as Christians, we can read that story that we're in. Dr. Wagner, God bless you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. To everybody else, it's for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Until next time, God bless.
Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list, or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.